Welcome back to Seek Strength and welcome back to Seekistan. I'm Owen, he's Dara. Today we are doing S&C Coaches React to Kyle Snyder. Now, don't be fooled, he had nothing to do with the Snyder Cut of the Justice League. Dara won't get that reference, but some of you will. Today, Kyle is an Olympic wrestler, 97 kilos. He's gold in Rio, silver in Tokyo, and he has 3 world championships among many other accolades, but they're some of the most notable achievements in his career, and we are reacting to...
Most notable of anything else is Kyle is an absolute animal of a human being.
Kyle is what you'd call a horse.
Yeah.
So this, just to reiterate, came from one of the comments in our video under Cameron Rogers, where we say, please let us know about athletes where they have S&C up that you would like to see done, as we can't know all the athletes, but we've found many good athletes from you guys. So the first video we've got up is Kyle Snyder, crazy workout highlights, coming to us from Training World.
Yeah, so the first exercise here is a double-handed straight arm lat pull down. They seem to be kind of mainstay in his training, or definitely from looking at his Instagram and a few of the different YouTube videos, we see a lot of these. We see them doing him single arm lat pull downs as well. A great exercise for wrestling, massive amounts of lat development. They're just a good bog standard exercise to do. Like, there's nothing special there. I don't think you need to do them very fast. I personally prefer the way he's doing them there, which is just very heavy.
So like straight out lat pull downs are typically done sitting upright or standing upright. Typically standing upright is a variation I prefer. I assume he's doing bent at the waist to kind of mimic the kind of wrestling positions. Now, we talk a lot about why you don't really want to be mimicking your sport in the gym, because it doesn't make sense in a lot of cases to do that. But in this case, when he's in this position, he's not really negatively affecting the pros of the straight arm lat pull down. He's not eliminating any of the benefits by being in that wrestling position. So there's no real reason to do it in that scenario or that style, but there's no reason not to do it that way. Preferably, most people would do it upright because you can keep a little bit more of an extended spine. Here's the next scenario. He's kind of closer to the single or double leg position you might see people going for in wrestling.
One issue you will see with that more bent over position rather than the upright variation that Garth was talking about is if you're not in the fully hinged over position at the hip and you're in a kind of quasi bent over position, you can get some loading at the back there, and that loading will be equivalent to loading of like a banded good morning where you're getting pulled forward, and that could lead to some extra kind of fatigue down there in the lower back that you don't necessarily want, but definitely when Kyle's all the way bent over at 90 degrees at the hip, just pulling down, he's probably not getting any of that kind of auxiliary fatigue in there.
Next up, we've got some what looks to be about 40 kilo weighted dips. So obviously any amount for a single rep. So weighted dips obviously massively beneficial for any kind of wrestlers. So as much upper body pressing and upper body strength as you can manage and still remain in your weight class, as much muscle mass, as much power output, much force output as you can manage is hugely important, and weighted dips are a great exercise. Some people do have a little bit of shoulder issues. It could be anatomical, it could be mobility, it could be not being accustomed to doing dips for a long enough period, not building up to them over a reasonable period of time. But if you can do dips safely and pain-free, then I think dips are very beneficial, especially weighted dips, which you'll see actually feature in our beginner strength program.
These look legitimately heavy, because there's a dumbbell on top and I think a few plates in the middle. So there is actually.
That's way more than 40 kilos. That's probably like 60 or 70 kilos.
Yeah. Definitely. I think they should be a mainstay for most people's programs, particularly like for the sprawling, pushing people away from you like that. You want that kind of security in your shoulders to be able to set your shoulders. It's not just about tricep extension with those dips. It's about being able to set your upper body and extend with a lot of force at your arms. Like there's more going on with a dip than just those triceps.
Couldn't they get an Olympian a proper set of bars to do dips on?
Yeah, he's doing it on like a crossover machine.
Come on.
Facilitate. It looks like there's 8 squat racks just down the line from him as well. Like, surely you can get a set of dip bars to go off the side of them.
He's an Olympian.
Yeah.
Get him a pair of dip bars.
A very good Olympian. This is something that seems to be a mainstay of his training as well, of just very heavy single reps.
Yes.
Now, I don't know, is that the classic thing of like they're the sessions that are being videoed and we talk about these when we do the reactions constantly, is that they're probably not just doing the really heavy single reps in their training sessions every day, but there's a video camera there or there's a film crew there today to video it. And it's the same thing with this, our dumbbell press, is that very, very heavy for a kind of rep or two and then he stops. Maybe he does that all the time in training, but maybe it's just because there's a film crew there to do it.
This looks like his own thing though, yeah. So obviously he's probably more likely to film one repetition maxes, heavy dumbbell press, an incline, same idea as the heavy weighted dips, upper body strength is hugely important.
Yeah. Now this is a bit of a conditioning piece. So he's obviously on like a rogue bike, pulling and tearing at the rogue bike by the looks of it, going as hard as he possibly can. He does some drilling as he hops off the bike here. You'll see it in a second. So we talk about like kind of drilling under fatigue, or where you mightn't want to do specific skill practice under fatigue quite a lot on the channel. And it's fairly well documented, fairly well studied why you mightn't want to be doing specific skill practice under fatigue. Although that might just be a kind of quick kind of interim piece as he gets his breath back. He's then into his box jumps. We've talked a lot about why you wouldn't want to do box jumps under fatigue and why it mightn't be the best thing for power production work to be doing it in a circuit. But you see a lot of wrestlers doing it. You see a lot of fighters doing it. It's probably not the best thing, but it seems to be kind of status quo at the moment.
So the reason you don't want to be doing any kind of plyometric work under fatigue or under high mods of conditioning is that essentially there's no real super compensation mechanism for speed work. Now, for power output, it's a little bit different, and it's some mitigating circumstances where that power output, where you're moving slower, for example, in accommodating resistance with the use of resisting bands, in some scenarios does seem to be, tentatively seem to show in some of the research that, for example, squats versus or jumps with resistance bands and accommodating resistance might be useful for power output. When it comes to just pure speed work or plyometrics, body weight stuff, not under fatigue, is really the way to go for a lot of the circumstances. So if you're doing box jumps when you're heavily fatigued, you're not really getting any power training. So he's still getting conditioning work here, so he's getting some kind of muscular endurance, he's still getting some lactic acid tolerance kind of loading, he's still getting aerobic work because he's keeping his heart rate high, he hasn't stopped moving for the course of the circuit, so he's getting those benefits. But when he's doing these box jumps under a lot of this kind of fatigue, he's just not moving as fast or explosive as he would otherwise. And unless we're moving fast and explosively, we're not training the method to move as fast and explosively as we possibly can. There's no scenario really when you're under fatigue doing underweighted box jumps where you get really fatigued and then suddenly your body will super compensate and understand that the idea here is to be faster. In reality, we're just kind of training yourself to be slower.
More heavy pressing here again. Heavy pressing in Kyle's case nearly always seems to be done in a seated or an inclined position, or obviously on a bench for bench pressing, but he seems to be into the heavier pressing while not standing basically. Then a good old truck pull. Once he gets this moving, he seems to be moving quite well with it, but it does take him a bit at the start. Have you ever pulled a very heavy sled?
Yeah.
It's that first, it's just once you get it going, it's the hard piece, that overcoming that static friction seems to be the hardest part.
The problem with pulling your obnoxiously large American truck is you don't really know what kind of loading you're getting. So you know you've pulled one truck, and if you have that same truck forever, then I suppose that is useful. But the problem with this is it's very hard to be consistent with it. How much are you loading? How do you warm up to a truck pull?
Yeah.
Like how much are you actually pulling it? How much to do with the incline? How much friction with tires in the incline is interfering with this? So it's certainly very heavy, so he's obviously getting benefit from it. But for a training point of view, it's not something you'd recommend people do a lot. You'd prefer to pull a sled and load it appropriately, and you know that you're getting constant friction on the same surface with no incline, whereas you don't really know what's happening with a truck.
Sleds just tend to be a hell of a lot more controllable as well. When you stop moving, the sled usually stops moving. The problem with trucks or cars or anything along those lines is it tends to just keep rolling for a small bit longer afterwards. Obviously, any incline has a much bigger effect the larger the mass of the vehicle is. So definitely a sled is a better way to go on this. Also, with the leaning into it like that, just having a small bit more support rather than just on either of the two shoulders might be a bit better. So using the strap that would go the whole way across the front, or using a harness that would brace you across the front would probably be a better option. I know those single loop over each shoulder became very popular when they started using them in the CrossFit Games. Prior to that, you tended to see more use of the harness, but obviously if you're using it in a kind of games context, you can't be wearing a harness because they just have to throw on each arm quite quickly. So I definitely think for training most athletes, a harness is better. You see most sprint work with kind of parachutes and stuff being done with harnesses on. It just gives slightly better support, allows you to impart a bit more force, and it's just a bit better overall, I think.
So speaking of heavy sleds, we have very heavy prowler push here. So Darren noticed something quite interesting about this is that he always seems to have that right leg forward, but maybe just his set, is that the like he has mostly forward when he's in his wrestling stance.
Yeah.
So he's kind of going from the prowler push back to kind of his wrestling stance again. Doesn't really wrong with that. There's no real problems with it. He's heavily reinforced his own positions in wrestling, hence he's being an Olympic gold medalist. So I don't really think there's any negatives there. And obviously heavy pushing for someone who needs high levels of power output and aerobic endurance, for wrestling, certainly very useful.
Yeah, I think certainly a sled like that, heavily weighted with the 2 upright handles, is going to be a very, very useful drill there, Particularly with wrestling as well, rather than the other grappling sports. With wrestling, you have a lot of friction with the floor. Mm-hmm. Like, those wrestling shoes are sticky.
Yes.
Like, he's really going to be able to push in when he's wrestling.
And obviously when you're doing a lot of hand fighting in the start, you're pushing into your opponent. A lot of times you're vying for a better position, so being able to push far beyond what your opponent away would have very obvious benefits.
So the sumo deadlift, using the rack as a kind of upright guide so he's not pulling back too far, seems to be a mainstay in his training. They're never incredibly heavy, but anytime I've seen him deadlifting on the clips on Instagram or in these videos, he's using straps, he's always sumo pulling, and then he nearly always has that support leg behind the barbell, presumably to stop him just pulling back and to force him to stay forward. Now, if you were to speculate why a coach might want him to stay forward, might need to put a bit more load on the back, might need to stop him kind of rocking back and just being able to extend his legs, which is kind of what you'd want a deadlifter to do. But I suppose if you're an athlete, you want to be specific with the stimulus you're giving in certain areas. In my opinion, he'd be much better off doing a conventional deadlift in that case. You'd be able to load the back more. And better from that again, when we do an RDL or a stiff-legged deadlift from the floor, you'd be far better able to load the back. You'd be able to use more appropriate loads, and you wouldn't have to use something like the upright of a squat leg to do it, or squat rack.
So we see a lot of pin pressing or concentric only pressing from him, so we never see the kind of full range of motion benching. So it could be a number of reasons for this. We can only speculate in this scenario. So it could be shoulders. Maybe it just doesn't tolerate the full range of motion. It could be that they're actively looking for the overload of the bench press. So in a similar scenario where we're talking about throwers and they do very heavy high bar squats to a heavy box, or a high box, not a heavy box. The box can be as light as you want, really. They're looking for that overloading and moving as fast as possible. So it's very possible he's looking for the same thing in this scenario, or it could be a combination of those reasons.
What we have now is a concentric only squat. So this is a squat starting at the bottom of the squat, just standing up with it. You would have commonly seen these used with athletes. It's kind of gone out of fashion a small bit. The background behind the concentric only squat is that most of the fatigue generated during training is generated during the eccentric and the amortization phase. So as you go back down into the squat, as you bring the barbell back down to the floor, as you bring the barbell back down onto your shoulders, right? The lengthening of a muscle under tension causes a lot more damage to the muscle than the concentric only portion. Now, in this case, where you get somebody just standing up with the barbell, that would be less fatiguing. You would see for an athlete who might be doing a lot of wrestling, a lot of other training throughout the day, there's a benefit to doing that. Just the concentric, you get all that kind of skill of lifting heavy weights. You get some of the training benefit, but you wouldn't get the same kind of tissue breakdown that you get if you were doing full squats. Now, one thing you will see is that in most cases when you do a concentric only squat, you drop the barbell or you drop it back down onto the floor or whatever you're going to do. In this case, he sits back down with his squats, so he stands up concentric only and then controls it back down, so he's still getting that lengthening under tension. So I'm just not quite sure what the reasoning for it would be. Possibly that bounce out of the bottom position might cause an issue with knees, hips, back, shoulders, whatever, but most of the time when you'd see kind of the concentric only squat being cited as beneficial for athletes in the literature, it's because it gets rid of that eccentric phase, although in this case there still seems to be an eccentric phase there.
So we just had some really heavy shrug there, and then some, again, concentric only benching, well, pin pressing from here, and so he's coming back, so concentric only press, so it seems to be like 170 or something, which is quite heavy. Probably similar reasons to what we mentioned before, but again in this scenario, he's doing the eccentric phase as well, lowering it back down, so likely similar reasons are what we can only speculate. So again, we've a very heavy straight arm lat pull downs in a kind of resting stance again. Preferably in this style, you just have them kind of stand upright, but as we mentioned, it's not massively important, and he is switching legs, and these look very heavy, so he's definitely getting a positive training effect from these.
You see here, the whole stack is being used.
Yeah.
Literally as heavy as you can go with that machine.
I kind of appreciate why they do a lot of their pressing from controlled environments in some ways. You know, I see like he does a lot of training, so you want to be as strategic with your fatigue as possible. So those seated presses, you know, you want to be as surgical with kind of what you're looking for. Seated presses, the pin pressing, you know, it is easier to control a lot of that stuff.
Absolutely.
What is quite interesting here, so we've got a really heavy split squat, so at least 180-ish, depends on these pounds or kilo plates. Now, we really like the idea of really heavy split squats, but really heavy split squats for a 1RM are something that's quite funny, because in Kyle Snyder, he's obviously an incredibly strong human being. There's a lot of potential, as is with most people, and it's always relative that when you go for that really heavy split squat, you're not really getting much of a training effect from a single repetition, because your potential for moving force through your legs with, say, a bilateral. A split squat is still bilateral, you know, it's not wholly unilateral. You know, you're not fully isolating one leg. You're still using both your legs, but the load is just being distributed a little bit more on the other leg. So if Kyle was to back squat, I'm sure he'd squat north of 220 or probably hit at least that. So it's not that 170-ish here for a single rep isn't productive, but in general, when we're having people do really heavy split squats, it's usually for somewhere between 3 to 5 reps. So you want to get more of a meaningful training effect. He's getting some here, obviously, but if you're going for tactically heavy split squats, which aren't very common in a training block, you're not going to be going super heavy in your split squats all the time. You want to be making the most use for that when you do go for those heavy split squats.
I think the other thing to think about with a split squat is, if you imagine unracking a barbell in a squat and you take 2 steps back, that setup, or the total you invest into a setup, is very, very little, right? With a split squat, you have to split your legs apart. In this case of the last video, he had to split his leg apart and bring the rear leg over a block, something on the floor, to stop his knee smashing into the ground. The setup, or the capital he has to put into that setup, is much more expensive than it would be for just a standard squat. So when you consider that setup takes probably twice as long or 3 times as long, you're in a much less stable position to then only do 1 rep. You don't really get a very good return on your investment, you know, for the total volume load of work you get done. It's usually why we'd see the reps only going as low as around 3 each side on the split squat.
So we've got more concentric only squats. So this is 190, maybe 200 kilos. So nice high bar position on this one. Interesting that he's not doing... Okay, so we've got just pin squats here, not concentric squats. Yeah. So pin squat. I'd be very interested to see what their reasoning for doing pin pressing and pin squats is. I'd like to see why not. I'd be very interested to see. I'm very open to a reason why. Yeah. I just would wonder. It's not that he's not getting benefits of them, but wrestlers would really do well, as most kind of grapplers, with high bar squats with full depth. I know people accuse us of loving high bar squats, but they do prove to be very valuable. So here's like a 180 pin press.
It's like accusing a carpenter of loving hammers. Very, very strong. Yes. Like, you have to give like massive strength. Just like absolutely, people ask us about prerequisites of strength or benchmarks of strength to be hitting if you're an athlete. Like the 180 kilo bench press there, 180 kilo pin press. Very, very strong just across the board. Not a mind to say for an athlete or for X, Y, and Z. He's just an incredibly strong athlete.
Absolutely.
We got this video because somebody commented on a previous video of ours of an athlete to check out. We'd really appreciate if you have people you'd like us to check out down below, or if there's more training footage of Kyle you'd like us to look at. We're really, really receptive to that. If you have questions, pop them in the comments below, and as always, we'll see you soon.